In the medieval world, there were no antibiotics, no sterile clinics, and no modern pills. Yet people lived through plague, famine, war, and childbirth, all with remedies drawn from kitchens, fields, and forests. These weren't just meals. They were medicine. Honey sealed wounds, garlic fought infections, fermented cabbage protected the gut. Long before science proved anything, they trusted instinct, tradition, and the healing power of food. Today, many of these superfoods still outperform modern drugs, not because they're trendy, but because they've worked for centuries, and their origins weren't pharmaceutical. They were survival. In medieval Europe, the kitchen was far more than a place to prepare meals. It was the pharmacy, the infirmary, and the first line of defense against disease. With physicians scarce and often unaffordable, families relied on inherited knowledge, a blend of trial, tradition, and deeply rooted belief to treat illness with what they had: food, herbs, and the land. For most, medical care didn't begin in a formal setting, but with a mortar and pestle on a wooden table. Women, in particular, carried the weight of this responsibility. They boiled onions to ease chest infections, steeped sage for fever, and applied poultices of mashed garlic or ground mustard seed for aches. Remedies passed down orally through generations formed the core of what modern scholars call domestic medicine, a practice as widespread as it was undocumented. Monasteries, too, served as centers of healing. Monks, trained in basic herbalism, cultivated gardens of plants with recorded uses: comfrey for wounds, yarrow for blood loss, horehound for cough. The Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and writer, compiled knowledge of over 200 plants and their effects on the body, drawn from both observation and scripture. In these texts, there was little distinction between the spiritual and the medical. Illness was often seen as divine punishment, healing an act of faith as much as care. Without germ theory, medieval people explained sickness through imbalance, rooted in the ancient concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Foods weren't just labelled by taste or texture, but by their supposed effect on these humours. Cabbage cooled an overheated body. Honey, considered warm and dry, was believed to draw out bad humours when applied to a wound. Even the most basic meals were judged by their medicinal potential. Porridge with leeks might ease digestion. Broth made from marrow bones was prescribed for the weak. Fermented drinks like mead or vinegar tonics were thought to purify the system. The line between nourishment and remedy barely existed. Everything a person consumed was viewed through a lens of balance and prevention. Access dictated options. Nobles might import spices, like cinnamon or clove, for warming the blood, while peasants relied on nettle, thyme, or garlic gathered fresh, dried in bunches above the hearth, then brewed or mashed, depending on the ailment. In rural regions, wise women and local herbalists filled the gap left by formal medicine, though their work was sometimes met with suspicion or accused of witchcraft. Despite the lack of scientific precision, some of these treatments proved remarkably effective. Honey's antibacterial properties, for instance, are now confirmed by modern research. Garlic has measurable antimicrobial effects. Fermented vegetables aid digestion and immunity. What began as instinct and often desperation has in many cases been validated centuries later. The medieval kitchen was not a place of luxury, but of necessity. Every plant, root, or spice had to earn its place. With no guarantees of survival and few professional healers within reach, the burden of health fell into the hands of those who could cook, gather, and hope. In that fire-lit room, food was life. And sometimes it was the only medicine they had. Across medieval Europe, honey held a dual status, both sacred and medicinal. It was among the few substances trusted in a world with limited medical knowledge, where most healing was improvised, and survival often rested on instinct and tradition. Honey, golden and incorruptible, was used in battlefield salves, monastery infusions, and folk remedies. Long before microbial theory, its effects were known by experience. Wounds treated with honey healed faster, stayed cleaner, and resisted rot. In the monastic infirmaries of the 12th and 13th centuries, honey was part of routine care. Monks in Benedictine and Cistercian communities cultivated hives as much for medicine as for sweetness. The Tequinum Sanitatis, a widely circulated medical manuscript of the late Middle Ages, described honey as hot and dry in nature, according to humoral theory, and useful in treating ulcers, sore throats, and skin injuries. Combined with herbs like thyme or sage, it was infused into teas or applied directly to wounds. On the battlefield, it served as an emergency antiseptic. Soldiers wounded by arrows, blades, or fire often had little access to trained surgeons. In some cases, the wound would be cleaned with wine or vinegar, then packed with honey to prevent putrefaction. During the Crusades, both Islamic and Christian sources documented its use. The Persian polymath, Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, recommended honey for dressing wounds in his Canon of Medicine, a text that remained standard across Europe for centuries. Its healing properties weren't just anecdotal. Honey's low moisture content and natural acidity make it inhospitable to bacteria. Its enzymes, particularly glucose oxidase, produce hydrogen peroxide in small amounts, enough to sanitize but not harm living tissue. Though medieval healers didn't know this biochemistry, they knew the results. Outside the infirmary, honey was integrated into daily preventative health. In England, mead, a fermented honey drink, was sometimes used in convalescence. Oxymel, a mixture of vinegar and honey, was taken as a tonic to clear the lungs or ease sore muscles. Manuscripts from the 14th century mention honey in dozens of preparations, including syrups for cough, poultices for infected cuts, and mixtures to soothe inflamed eyes. Its significance also had spiritual weight. In Christian Europe, honey symbolized purity and divine providence. Monasteries saw bees as sacred laborers, and wax from their hives lit the interiors of churches. To apply honey was not just a medical act, it was part of a worldview where healing, nature, and belief were intertwined. Despite centuries of medical advancement, modern research validates what medieval people practiced by necessity. Studies confirm that raw honey, especially types like Manuka, inhibits bacterial growth and speeds wound recovery. It remains in use today in clinical settings, often for burns and ulcers resistant to conventional treatments. In a time when survival depended on available resources, honey offered a rare combination of abundance, longevity, and effectiveness. Whether in the hands of a monk, a village healer, or a wounded soldier, it was more than a remedy. It was one of the few substances that could be trusted when little else could dot in medieval Europe. Garlic was more than a food, it was a tool for survival. Its pungent cloves were crushed, boiled, eaten raw, or rubbed directly onto the skin. Across centuries and cultures, garlic was used to treat infections, strengthen the body, and ward off unseen dangers, both physical and spiritual. Among the earliest references is the 9th century Anglo-Saxon Leech Book of Bald, a medical text that prescribed garlic for treating chest pain, digestive troubles, and even leprosy. One notable remedy in the book combined garlic with onion and wine, left to ferment in a brass vessel. Recent scientific testing of this mixture, dubbed Bald's Isolve, has shown it to be effective against modern antibiotic-resistant bacteria, revealing that the perceived value of garlic was more than superstition. Garlic's antimicrobial qualities made it indispensable during outbreaks of disease. When the Black Death reached Europe in the mid-14th century, garlic was used in both rural villages and monastic infirmaries. It was believed to cleanse the blood and strengthen the body's internal balance. Monks would crush cloves into tonics and mix them with vinegar or honey to make them more palatable. Some wore garlic around the neck or rubbed it on their skin, believing it could block the miasma, the bad air thought to cause illness. Its reputation wasn't limited to Western Europe. In Byzantine medical traditions, garlic was used to stimulate appetite and combat fatigue. In Islamic medical texts, including those by Avicenna in the Canon of Medicine, garlic was listed as a warming agent, useful in eliminating phlegm and harmful bodily moisture. Its properties were recognized from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, across Christian and Muslim worlds alike. Garlic also carried symbolic power. It was considered a ward against spirits, curses, and bad luck. While these beliefs lacked scientific basis, they reflected garlic's deeper cultural role. In a time when medicine was limited and fear of the unknown was constant, garlic stood as a barrier, simple, accessible, and strong-smelling enough to command respect. For laborers and soldiers, garlic was a daily staple. It was thought to improve stamina and preserve health during long campaigns. In some regions, it was added to broth or bread for energy before harvest or battle. Its strong taste and durable form made it ideal for storing through winter or carrying. On the road, garlic's legacy is not merely folklore. Modern analysis confirms its allicin content has antibacterial and antifungal properties. What medieval healers recognized through observation, science has since proven with precision. In a world with limited remedies, garlic became essential, not by chance, but through centuries of practical use. From monastery gardens to plague-ridden towns, it remained a constant, a sharp, bitter root that demanded no luxury, only belief in its strength. In medieval Europe, bone broth was more than sustenance. It was survival in liquid form. In an era marked by war, famine, and illness, it served as the most accessible, restorative remedy available to common people and nobility alike. Simmered over open hearths or monastery fires, the slow extraction of marrow, collagen, and minerals from animal bones transformed scraps into nourishment. Bone broth was not a culinary luxury. It was born of necessity, especially during the long winters or after poor harvests, when resources were scarce. Villagers, facing food shortages or recovering from illness, turned to whatever remained: discarded joints, animal feet, even cracked skulls. These were simmered for hours or even days in iron pots. The resulting broth, enriched with root, vegetables, or wild herbs when available, delivered fat, protein, and warmth. In monastic infirmaries, broth was part of the standard care for the weak and the dying. Texts from the Benedictine order describe preparations of strong soup made from beef or mutton bones for those too frail to eat solid food. The 12th century abbess and healer Hildegard of Bingen documented the medicinal value of such broths in her treatises, prescribing them for fever and exhaustion. Bone broth was believed to rebuild strength, rehydrate the body, and rekindle internal heat, a vital concept under the prevailing humoral theory of medicine. Hospitals, operated by religious institutions, often served broth as the main form of nourishment for patients. In places like the Hôtel in Paris, founded in the 7th century and expanded during the High Middle Ages, meat broth was prioritized for the sick, especially those recovering from injuries or childbirth. It was one of the few reliable interventions for improving health outcomes when formal medicine had little else to offer. Beyond the sick room, it was a battlefield necessity. During extended campaigns, soldiers received bone broth when supplies ran low or digestion was compromised by cold and stress. It was easy to transport, required minimal ingredients, and could be made from animals killed for other purposes. Nothing went to waste. The cultural value of broth extended into folk traditions as well. In many regions, it was the first food given after fasting, mourning, or childbirth. It represented comfort, transition, and resilience. In homes where even meat was a rarity, the bones themselves were seen as valuable, a final offering of strength from the animal. Modern science validates these choices. Bone broth contains gelatin, amino acids like glycine, and minerals leached from the bone matrix, all components that support tissue repair, joint health, and digestion. But in the medieval context, the science didn't need explanation. The effects were visible in real time: clearer skin, steadier energy, and the return of appetite. When food was scarce and medicine unreliable, bone broth was a promise, not of a cure, but of life continuing, one warm bowl at a time. In medieval Europe, when the cold months turned fertile fields into barren ground, preservation wasn't convenience, it was survival. Among the most reliable methods was fermentation. Cabbage, abundant in temperate climates, became the ideal candidate. Once shredded and packed with salt, it transformed over weeks into a sour, nutrient-rich food resembling modern sauerkraut. This wasn't just a culinary development, it was medicinal, practical, and life-saving. Without refrigeration or fresh imports, families depended on preserved stores to endure the winter. Fermented cabbage, kept for months in cool cellars or buried barrels, protected from spoilage by its acidity. In regions like the Germanic states, the Baltics, and Slavic lands, it became a staple by the 11th and 12th centuries. These communities understood long before microbial science that fermentation created something more potent than raw vegetables alone. The preparation process was passed down through generations. Salt drew out moisture, enabling lactic acid bacteria to flourish and suppress harmful microbes. The resulting brine acted as a natural sealant. It didn't just preserve, it altered the food, increasing vitamin C content and introducing beneficial organisms that supported digestion. At a time when scurvy and intestinal illness were common in winter, fermented cabbage played a protective role. Medieval texts offer glimpses into these practices. The 12th century Tachinum Sanitatis, a health handbook translated from Arabic medical thought into Latin, emphasized the benefits of sour vegetables for balancing bodily humors and aiding digestion. Though lacking today's scientific terms, the observations were practical and often accurate in seafaring cultures. Fermented cabbage traveled aboard ships to prevent vitamin deficiencies during long voyages. Centuries before James Linn's 18th century scurvy experiments, northern European traders and sailors were already relying on sour cabbage to maintain health in vitamin-deprived conditions. The Hanseatic League, a major medieval trade network, is believed to have transported fermented vegetables across the Baltic and North Seas for both preservation and sustenance. The fermentation process also created resilience. In cities or famine-stricken villages, where access to fresh food vanished overnight, a sealed barrel of cabbage could mean the difference between nourishment and starvation. It could be eaten alone, added to stews, or served to the sick. It was especially valued for the very young and very old, those most vulnerable to infection and undernourishment. Modern nutritional science confirms what medieval households practiced through observation and necessity. Fermented cabbage contains probiotics, enzymes, and compounds that support gut flora and immune defense, elements that influence not just digestion but resistance to disease. Fermentation required no magic, only salt, time, and patience. Yet in the medieval world, where food could rot within days and medicine was uncertain, a sour barrel of cabbage became a quiet triumph, a hedge against hunger, decay, and winter's grip. Oxymel, a potent blend of vinegar and honey, was a staple of medieval household medicine, administered to those battling chest infections, fatigue, or fevers. Its name comes from the Greek oxymeli, meaning acid and honey, and it endured in Europe's medical traditions from ancient times through the late Middle Ages. Physicians and laypeople alike prescribed it as a stimulant, a purgative, and an expectorant, a kind of liquid fire, believed to balance the body's internal forces. In a world where disease was often attributed to imbalances in the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, oxymel was meant to thin, thick humors and stimulate expulsion through sweat, breath, or stool. Vinegar was thought to cut through congestion, while honey soothed and preserved the mixture. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't meant to be. The discomfort was part of its perceived effectiveness. Texts from medical authorities of the period frequently mention oxymel. The 12th century medical encyclopedia Tequinum Sanitatis, derived from earlier Arabic sources like Ibn Butlan of Baghdad, describes vinegar-honey preparations as cleansing and invigorating. Hildegard of Bingen, the German Benedictine abbess and polymath, wrote about honey vinegar infusions for treating persistent coughs and digestive stagnation. Her contemporaries in monasteries and infirmaries adopted similar formulations. Oxymel was versatile. It was often mixed with herbs, such as thyme, sage, or garlic, to create variations tailored for different ailments. A more concentrated version might be used for sore throats or chest congestion. A diluted draught was thought to aid digestion or revive the exhausted. Apothecaries sometimes included it as a delivery medium for powdered drugs or purgatives. Its role extended beyond the elite. Farmers and artisans, with no access to physicians, prepared oxymel at home using apple cider vinegar, wildflower honey, and seasonal herbs. It became part of the domestic health routine, administered at the first sign of chill or before heavy labor. Because the ingredients were shelf-stable and required no costly imports, it was practical across class lines. The use of vinegar tonics, in general, also reflected broader medieval beliefs about cleanliness and resistance to miasma. The so-called bad air believed to spread plague and fevers. Sharp, acrid substances were considered protective. During outbreaks of illness, vinegar was used to wash hands, wipe surfaces, and even soak coins. When mixed with honey, it was consumed as a means of internal purification, fighting invisible threats from within. Modern research has partially validated some of these practices. Vinegar has mild antibacterial properties, and honey is known for its soothing antimicrobial qualities, though not a cure-all. The combination has persisted in various traditional medicines into the present day. From fire cider in folk remedies to cough syrups in Eastern Europe. In the medieval imagination, pain meant progress. The sting of vinegar down the throat, followed by a honeyed aftertaste, wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Oxymel didn't comfort, it confronted. And for those facing a lifetime of illness with few alternatives, that was often enough. Grain was the backbone of medieval life, not just as sustenance, but as quiet medicine. Barley, rye, and other ancient cereals were the daily fare of peasants, the ritual meal of monks, and, when illness struck, the fallback nourishment of nobles, who had once turned their backs on such simplicity. Monastic communities, barley held a special place, known to Roman and Greek physicians for its cooling and moistening properties. It passed into medieval medical tradition through texts like the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna and the writings of Galen, which influenced both Islamic and Christian medical schools. In monastic infirmaries, barley water was served to the feverish, barley gruel to the weak. These soft preparations were thought to soothe the stomach, cleanse the blood, and ease inflammation. Not luxurious, but dependable. Rye, more resistant to cold climates than wheat, dominated diets in northern and central Europe. Coarse, dense, and dark, it filled the stomach and could be stored through the lean months, though rye had its risks. Ergot poisoning from contaminated grain led to periodic outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire. It remained a crucial crop for centuries. When properly prepared, it provided durable nutrition to those who could afford little else. Medieval medical texts, including the Tequinum Sanitatis, recommend barley and other grains not only for physical recovery but for spiritual discipline. Grain-based foods were seen as humbling and purifying. This was especially true in monastic communities, where meat was often restricted. Monks consumed grain, stews, breads, and porridges as part of both religious observance and preventive care. The Benedictine rule emphasized moderation and digestion, making grains central to the monastic diet and medicinal regimen. Grain was accessible, filling, and relatively safe. For commoners, it was the one ingredient that could be counted on. For the ill and the aging, it was often the last food they could digest. Barley broth, slow-cooked with herbs and a little salt, became the final meal for many, not by ceremony, but by necessity, even among the elite, who favored meat and spiced delicacies. Illness often brought a return to childhood foods, porridge, crusty barley bread, thin gruels. Physicians treating noble patients during recovery prescribed such fare as a means of balancing the humors and restoring energy without burdening the body. Modern nutritional science affirms what centuries of use already suggested. Whole grains like barley and rye are rich in fiber, slow to digest, and support gut health. Their complex carbohydrates offer steady energy. In the medieval world, where survival and nourishment were often inseparable, these humble grains proved themselves not just as food, but as quiet, steady healers. In a time when disease arrived without warning and vanished entire families within days, elderberry was one of the few defenses villagers could reach for. The dark purple fruit of Sambucus nigra, common across medieval Europe, featured prominently in medicinal recipes, household remedies, and protective rituals. It offered no guarantees, but when the plague moved fast and the physicians moved, Slow, elderberry became a line of resistance. The elder tree had been steeped in symbolism since ancient times. Germanic and Norse traditions associated it with protection and boundaries. But beyond myth, it was the fruit, small, bitter, easily dried or boiled, that earned a place in the herbal medicine cabinets of monastic infirmaries and peasant kitchens alike. Elderberries were used to make syrups, wines, decoctions, and pastes, most often given for fevers, chest infections, and colds. The Tarquinum Sanitatis, a 14th century health manual derived from Arab sources, records elderberry as a cooling agent prescribed to expel excess bile and mucus. During the waves of bubonic plague in the 14th and 15th centuries, elderberry remedies were widely prepared. Though no cure for Yersinia pestis existed, herbalists and lay healers believed elderberry helped cleanse the body, support breathing, and protect the heart. In some regions, it was taken as syrup before entering plague-stricken households or burned with herbs to clean the air. The logic followed the dominant theory of the time: miasma, corrupted air, needed to be countered with sharp purifying scents and internal tonics. Monastic records from southern France and parts of the Rhineland mention elderberry-infused wines administered during epidemics. In 1485, the plague in England returned in what some believed to be a mutated form, known as the sweating sickness. Remedies circulated again, many of them based on elderflower or elderberry. The College of Physicians in London, though skeptical of folk cures, made no official objection to their use, especially in rural areas with no trained doctors. Elderberry wasn't limited to oral medicine. Compresses made from the boiled berries or leaves were applied to swellings or buboes. Syrups were often spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or vinegar, not just for flavor, but to combine multiple cleansing ingredients thought to counteract contagion. Today, scientific analysis has confirmed that elderberries contain anthocyanins and flavonoids with anti-inflammatory and antiviral properties. While they cannot prevent or cure major illnesses alone, lab studies have shown elderberry extract may shorten the duration of flu symptoms by boosting cytokine production and blocking virus replication in early stages. The same principles lie behind modern elderberry syrups sold in pharmacies across Europe and North America. To the medieval mind, elderberry stood at the boundary between the known and the unknown, medicine, myth, and memory. Whether in a monastery garden or the hands of a local wise woman, it represented a small act of defiance in the face of unstoppable disease. In the medieval world, where cold could be deadly and internal imbalances were feared as much as external wounds, mustard was more than food. It was fire, cultivated in gardens, ground by hand, and applied to bodies seeking warmth or balance. Mustard seeds, particularly from Brassica nigra and Sinapis alba, were used in kitchens and infirmaries across Europe for their sharpness, both of flavor and effect. The foundational theory of medieval European medicine was humorism, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman systems, notably those of Hippocrates and Galen. Health was believed to depend on the balance of four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each had corresponding qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Illness was interpreted as an excess or deficiency in one of these. Mustard, considered hot and dry, was used to counteract cold or moist conditions, especially those believed to cause sluggish digestion, respiratory congestion, and joint pain. In monastic herbals and medical treatises, such as Hildegard of Bingen, Physica, or the Compendium Medicinae, by Gilbertus Anglicus, mustard is praised for its stimulating effects. It was often prepared as a poultice, ground seeds mixed with vinegar or wine, then applied directly to the skin to increase blood flow. This was especially common in treating chronic cold limbs, arthritis, or muscle stiffness. The warmth it generated was literal. In winter, when stone cottages lacked insulation and fuel was scarce, some rural families rubbed mustard-infused oils onto cracked hands or feet. Applied with cloth and left to sit, the paste produced a burning sensation. That signaled its effectiveness. It was uncomfortable, sometimes even damaging, but, to those desperate for circulation, it was a remedy accepted despite the risk. Internally, mustard was taken to heat the stomach. Physicians might prescribe a teaspoon of ground seed before meals to stimulate digestion, reduce gas, or provoke sweating. In cases of chest congestion, mustard plasters were applied over the ribs, meant to draw out phlegm. Even spiritual medicine played a role. Mustard appeared in religious texts as a symbol of growth and potency, further reinforcing its perceived curative power. By the late Middle Ages, apothecaries across cities like London, Avignon, and Prague kept mustard seed among their inventories. Its reputation persisted, not just for its medicinal impact, but for the visible reaction it produced: heat, redness, discomfort, signs medieval thinkers interpreted as proof of its healing force. In medieval Europe, long before refrigeration or year-round harvests, preservation was survival. Among the most valued were dried fruits, figs, dates, raisins, and prunes, carried across trade routes from the Levant, North Africa, and Southern Europe. More than a source of sweetness, they were tools of nourishment and medicine. Figs held a special status. Imported through Mediterranean ports like Venice, Marseille, and Barcelona, they appeared frequently in medical texts. The Taquinum Sanitatis, a 14th-century health manual derived from earlier Arabic sources, recommended figs for softening the bowels, cleansing the intestines, and easing the discomforts of aging. Their gentle laxative effect was prized in a time when many diets were heavy in bread and meat, but low in fiber. Bound by religious fasting and restricted diets, turned to figs and similar fruits for both nutrition and healing. In the Benedictine rule, meals were often simple and infrequent. Dried fruits offered a dense concentration of energy with minimal preparation. When taken at dawn or after long silence, they were valued not just for sustenance, but for their calming, anti-inflammatory properties. Especially in treating throat ailments and internal dryness, medical authorities of the period, including Constantine the African and later Bartholomaeus Anglicus, recorded dried fruits in their formularies. Figs steeped in wine were given to the sick as a digestive tonic. Raisins mixed with vinegar or honey became part of syrups for coughs. Dates, although rarer in northern regions, were prescribed for weakness or during recovery from fever, believed to moisten the humors and strengthen the heart. Beyond the cloisters and courts, merchants and travelers carried bundles of dried fruit as portable, stable food. Apothecaries sold them alongside spices and medicinal herbs, treating them not as luxury, but as functional healing agents. In a world where illness often began in the gut, figs were a modest yet vital line of defense. In the medieval period, cow's milk was often considered unstable, difficult to preserve, and potentially harmful to the sick. Instead, the kitchens of monasteries, noble households, and apothecaries turned to an alternative: almond milk. This was not a novelty, but a mainstay of elite cuisine and medicinal practice from at least the 12th century onward, prepared by soaking almonds, grinding them finely, and straining them through cloth. Almond milk offered a smooth, digestible liquid rich in oils, minerals, and energy. It was included in dozens of medieval recipe books, such as La Viandia and Form of Curie, where it appeared as both a cooking ingredient and a medicinal base. Because it required imported almonds, it was typically found among the upper classes, especially during Lent, when animal products were forbidden by the Church. Physicians influenced by Greco-Arabic medical traditions praised almonds for their moist and warm qualities. In humoral theory, these properties counteracted dryness in the body, making almond milk ideal for treating internal inflammation, ulcers, and fevers. The Taquinum Sanitatis, based on Arabic health texts brought to Europe via Sicily and Spain, listed almond preparations as suitable for calming the stomach and restoring strength in childbirth recovery. Almond milk was part of the postpartum regimen. Midwives, operating under both folk knowledge and learned medical instruction, recommended it to new mothers for replenishing lost fluids and gentle nourishment. When sweetened with honey or mixed with rosewater, it served both as comfort and a controlled remedy beyond milk. Almonds were also pressed into oil, used in wound treatment and as a salve for dry skin or inflamed eyes. Almond pastes were sometimes blended with medicinal herbs and consumed by the chronically ill or elderly. In a time when both survival and social identity were embedded in what one consumed, almond milk symbolized both refinement and recovery, an elegant remedy backed by centuries of recorded use. In medieval Europe, long before distilled pharmaceuticals or standardized doses, healing often began in a garden, a field, or along a riverbank. Herbal infusions, hot water poured over leaves, flowers, or roots were foundational to daily health practices across all social classes. Whether prepared by monastic physicians, village healers, or household caretakers, these infusions were both medicine and memory. Key medicinal plants like nettle, yarrow, mint, and horehound were commonly used. Nettle, rich in iron and thought to purify the blood, was infused for fatigue and joint pain. Yarrow, recognized for its astringent properties, was believed to stop bleeding and reduce fevers. Mint treated indigestion and nausea, while horehound, bitter and aromatic, was prescribed for coughs and chest congestion. Medieval medical theory, dominated by Galenic principles, revolved around balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each herb was classified by its qualities: hot, cold, moist, or dry, and matched to the patient's condition. This system, drawn from Greco-Roman and Islamic medical writings, informed diagnoses and dictated which herbal teas should be used, when, and how. Monasteries preserved much of this knowledge. Works like Hortulus by Walafrid Strabo in the 9th century and the Physica of Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century detailed plant uses in clear, observational terms. These texts were both scientific and devotional, blending empirical treatment with Christian worldview. In monastic gardens, herbs were not just cultivated, but categorized, recorded, and shared. Outside religious centers, knowledge moved through families. Women, in particular, were stewards of herbal tradition. Herbal's manuscripts, listing plants, their properties, and medical uses, were copied by hand or orally preserved. The Leech Book of Bald, an Old English medical text from the 10th century, includes remedies using fennel, mugwort, and betony. By the 14th century, translated herbals like Herbarium Apelli were common among literate households. In times of illness or childbirth, teas brewed from dried herbs offered a first line of defense. Infusions were safer than untreated water and easier to consume than raw plants. For the poor, they were often the only form of treatment available. These brews represented centuries of accumulated trial and observation. In every pot steeped on a hearth or monastery brazier, there was more than healing, there was heritage. The hand that picked the leaves often remembered the one who first showed where they grew.